Everest Live. It's August 5th, about 6:30 p.m. Skardu time. We have an eyewitness account of what happened during the Broad Peak avalanche and some updates as to what's happening on the mountain right now with the body recovery. I just got off the phone with a good friend, Jenjen Lama, who's an aspirant IFMGA guide, and he was managing base camp and guiding on K2 for 7 Summit treks when the avalanche happened. He was a key part of the rescue operations, and I was able to kind of hear from him. And I think, the information that he just shared with me shed some light on many of the questions that people are asking about what happened during the avalanche. And I'm going to try to share those here. Forgive me if I'm not as eloquent as usual. This information is very fresh. But before we do that, I want to jump in and update as to what's happening with the body recovery efforts. Today, a rescue team led by Mingmaji, support from Sirbaz Khan, were able to bring down the bodies of 3 more climbers to base camp. They were able to recover Nim's Purja, Nima Sherpa, and Chinese climber Wang Zong to bring them down to base camp, and their bodies will, of course, be now brought on to Skardu and onward to their families. The rescue and recovery efforts, I'll get more into this later, but have been extremely dangerous. And I think we can't understate the bravery and determination and the effort put in by the rescue teams. Truly, truly heroic stuff. And I know I've been praising Mingmaji throughout all this, but it's really incredible how he stepped up to the bat for his community and led this. And I think that without his leadership, we'd be looking at a very, very different scenario. So from Everest Live, from everyone, Mingmaji, just want to send out so much respect to you. And so now this is what we have, with the bodies of Yukta Gurung, Nadira El Harthi, Wang Zong, Kilu Sherpa, Nima Sherpa, Gelu Sherpa, and Nim's Purja have been successfully recovered off the mountain. There have been partial remains of the American climber Mallory have been recovered, and the remains of Nawang Tindu and Sohil Shakai still remain on the mountain. Now, I think it's probably hearing from Jenjen, hearing from others on the mountain. Nawang Tindu's body is in a very, very difficult place to reach, above 6,000 meters. There were attempts to recover his body. 2 very, very strong climbing Sherpas from Nepal, Speed Dawa and Pem Dorje Sherpa, made attempts to reach Nawang Tindu's body, and they themselves were caught up in avalanches 2 times, according to Jenjen. One of those avalanches very nearly took out Mingmaji and the whole rescue team. Again, this is just to say how dangerous and how hard everyone's been working to bring closure to the families. Unfortunately, this isn't confirmed, but I think when you look at it, the chances of recovering these 3 bodies, the risks that would entail, or the difficulty of it being so high, are probably quite slim and growing slimmer over time. So now to talk about what happened on the mountain, according to Jenjen Lama. Jenjen was on K2, I believe at Camp 1. When you looked across the Broad Peak, as I mentioned earlier, the mountains 2 are quite close together. They're just across the glacier from one another. And he saw this huge avalanche kick off, and he filmed it, as you can see in the video here. It was quite a massive avalanche, and what Jenjen was saying was, and this is common in the mountains, but apparently very common on Broad Peak, is that smaller avalanches just go down that zone all the time, all throughout the day, all throughout the night. It's just a very avalanche-prone area. So seeing an avalanche like this is not something that's completely out of the ordinary. It's not something that is completely out of context. What Jenjen said about this particular avalanche and what made him pay attention and film it was that this one had 2 different point sources. It triggered off to the left and to the kind of the head wall off to the right as part of what made it so incredibly massive. He filmed it, and after that avalanche happened, he radioed. So I guess I'm going to take a step back. And of the 10 climbers, there were 3 different teams that were going together. There was the elite exped team, which was Nims and Yukta. You had a team from Imagine, which is Mingmaji's company. That was Wang Zong and Kilu Sherpa. And then you had a team from Seven Summits, which was Nadira Gyelu and Nawang Tindu. Mallory, was also, she was climbing with Sohil. So, that's 4 teams that were on the mountain. And each of those teams have sort of, while they were climbing together, the coordination and the monitoring of those teams are happening in each of their own base camps or in each of their own infrastructure. When Jenjen heard about the avalanche, he radioed Nawang and he radioed Gyelu. Neither of them picked up. He didn't think much of it because it's very, very common to keep your radio off to save battery while you're on the mountain. You can't charge once you're up there. There isn't enough battery in the radios to keep it on to going from base camp to summit. So people were alarmed. He alerted the Seven Summits base camp on Broad Peak saying, please try to get in touch with the climbers. There's been an avalanche. Let's just make sure everyone is okay. And then as the day transpired, basically it wasn't until later in the evening, after repeated attempts to contact their team, that the Seven Summits group, Jenjen and others in the Seven Summits crew started to reach out to other camps, asking them if they had heard from their climbers that were up on the mountain. And it was only until the evening when all the 4 expeditions realized that all of their climbers hadn't gotten in touch, and that potentially that avalanche was what it turned out to be. It wasn't until people back in Kathmandu on the Seven Summits team started looking at the GPS trackers of the people on the mountain that they realized that they were all showing a similar pattern, and that the likelihood of a major accident and a major avalanche was very, very high. It's important to emphasize, a lot of people are asking this question: why was there 12 hours that went by between the avalanche and between when the rescue was initiated? The factors in that are, I'm touching on them here. They're multiple. One is that there's expeditions all over the Karakoram, all happening at the same time. Each of them sort of operate in their own pods, but there isn't sort of this like main command center that's checking and watching everything and everyone as they happen. Part of that is the communication difficulties. Another big part of it is when you look at Broad Peak Base Camp, there's no internet there. They don't have access. They can't actually watch the trackers of their climbers. It's not like Everest where you're totally connected via cell towers, via Starlink. In Pakistan, you can't use Starlink. There's no internet connectivity. So all they have is radio contact. And it's not uncommon for climbers to turn off their radios for extended periods of time. So in that communication shadow, each of the expeditions were sort of assuming the same thing. It was only later in the day that actually people put the puzzle pieces together. I think that, is it possible that you could have more rigorous communication protocols? Is it possible that, yes, you could create a much more efficient system for checking in and all that stuff? Yes, of course. But the real practical realities of the way these expeditions are managed and run and coordinated, given the scope and the scale and the chaotic nature of them, makes it very, very difficult to do that. Modern Himalayan expeditions are designed to be adaptive and not rigorous, because once you sort of have adaptive processes and protocols, it's very difficult. Rigorous protocols, it's very difficult to adapt to changing conditions, which is what defines Himalayan climbing. So once they then figured out what was happening, Mingmaji and the Seven Summits team and kind of the coordination actually happened on K2, because that's where the company leaders, where people like Jenjen, who were the base camp coordinators, were all there. And they decided, they realized what had happened, and they stayed up all night putting together the protocols for the rescues that kicked off the next day. In the process, too, they decided that conditions on K2 were too risky. They decided that the need at Broad Peak Base Camp was too great. And they called off the K2 expeditions, and everyone descended down to Broad Peak Base Camp. Then, as I mentioned, as the recovery efforts continued, the conditions on Broad Peak were extremely dangerous. And I know I mentioned this earlier, but the fact that rescuers were caught in avalanches 2 times while trying to recover the bodies illustrates the conditions that are faced in the Karakoram. It also illustrates how seriously everybody took this and how hard everybody worked to bring the bodies back. I think other things that I took away from my conversation with Jenjen was there were questions about, well, the avalanche conditions. Weren't the avalanche conditions like it had been snowing? It snowed from the 22nd to the 26th steadily, 4 or 5 days of continuous snowfall. Obviously, that leads to avalanche danger and sketchy avalanche conditions. Why did they continue to go in those conditions? Why did the teams make the choice to go up? So Jenjen shared with me that they had spoken with the Broad Peak teams from Seven Summits, and they actually told them to hold back a day. The reason that they told them to hold back a day, though, was not for the avalanche conditions. The protocols Jenjen mentioned, and this is something I've heard from many sources, the protocols in the Karakoram are you have to wait 4 or 5 days after the snow falls for the solar radiation to kind of consolidate the snowpack and to make the climbing safe. But what Jenjen said is like practically that's impossible because your weather windows there are only 2 or 3 days long. And by the time you've waited for the snowpack to consolidate, it's snowed again. The conditions in the Karakoram are just inherently dangerous. And that is what it is. I can quote Jenjen, and he said, climbing is a do or die decision. It's 50-50. If you make it to the top of a peak in the Karakoram, you did it by luck. You have to go out into dangerous conditions and hope for the best. Otherwise, there's no climbing that happens. He believed that NIMS and the teams that did make the decision to go forward, they were experienced guides. Yukta and NIMS were like really strong. And he believed that they went up onto Broad Peak. They moved up from Camp 2 to Camp 3 when the avalanche happened, believing that the conditions were as good as they were going to get. And this is an example of objective danger more than it's an example of poor decision making in that regard. The truth of this is going to be debated forever. I just wanted to share Jenjen's opinion, which I trust because he was there. I think the important thing to emphasize, and remember all this, and what I was saying earlier, and I'm all over the place, apologize for this. What I was saying earlier is that Seven Summits did want to hold their team back by a day. And that wasn't because the avalanche conditions were going to improve. The weather window looked like it was going to be for 3 or 4 days. The reason he said to hold them back was because actually the ropes that were fixed, they had an earlier expedition go up on the 18th and 19th, and they found that the ropes that were fixed were in bad shape. And Jenjen knew that team from the Seven Summits side didn't have a ton of experience setting anchors, fixing ropes, ensuring safety in that way. And so they sent them up. They wanted them to go up a day later, knowing that Yukta and NIMS had the experience to make the route safer for them. And that was why they asked them to hold back. But in discussions in base camp, the Seven Summits team decided to go up as a group. And that's where we ended up here. So I think for me, the takeaways on this and what I want to share after this super long dispatch is that the rescuers truly risked their lives for the family and for the community of the climbers that passed. And they deserve an incredible amount of respect and gratitude for that. Mingmaji's leadership has been very crucial in this happening. Things in Pakistan are not as robust in terms of rescue and helicopter facilities. And it's very clear that his leadership has made the body recoveries possible. it seems like the teams went up into avalanche terrain. They went up on the mountain, knowing the conditions, but also making an educated decision about the risk before they did it. And I think that it just helps us understand some of the mindsets and the thinking behind it. And I think the 12-hour gap is not a case of major individual or structural neglect. It's a case of the confusion and some of the just inherent difficulties in mounting rescues and recovering and ensuring safety in the Karakoram. I think this is shedding light on, to me at least, why climbing the Karakoram is still very real and very dangerous. And it just has helped me understand what happened. So as always, my love and compassion and light is going out to everybody who's having a hard time. It's been a long run for me personally, for all of us. It's just been day after day of trying to get our brains around this. And it's inherent to what we do. It's inherent to our community. But none of that makes it easier. So I just want to thank everybody who sent along their support. And I want to also reciprocate that support to everybody in our world who's trying to wrestle with all of this and all the complications and complexities of it. That's dispatch for today, everyone. I'll keep you posted as things continue to evolve and as we continue to learn more. Thank you, Jenjen, for sharing your story with all of us.